today we're going to have really a master class discussion led by Chi-hui and with Pete Nix and Carrie Lozano. And we've heard from each of them over the years several times, and it's just really wonderful to have them with us again. But if you think you're coming tomorrow but you're not sure, talk to us and make sure that we know that you're coming. So thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Vince. It's great to be here. First, I want to thank Sahar. I thought that was a great presentation, a really great setup for the conversation that we want to have here with Carrie and Pete. And I have to say, I'm just really pleased to be here to facilitate this conversation with two folks who I have much respect for. These are two folks who are respectively at the top of their game professionally, artistically, in the documentary ecosystem, and who have over the past 2 decades really led their work with commitments to political activism and community. And so we're going to get into that. And I think this conversation is really timely too at a moment where we're seeing a lot of disruption within the commercial documentary sphere and a real growing unsustainability within the indie side too. And so there's lots of questions that are coming up, especially at a moment where we are seeing the role of storytelling so important to larger capital D democracy as well. And I think that we will talk a bit about the role of documentary within that. But really excited to be here with you too. And Pete, I want to start with you, and maybe we can ground the conversation today, just begin it with a bit of information, just a bit of reflection on your filmmaking practice. A lot of your career has been defined by a commitment to telling stories around, mainly independently produced stories, around the public institutions in Oakland. A very specific commitment to place and a observational approach. And tell us a bit about how you landed on this approach and how it's evolved over time.
I'm not totally sure how I landed on it, but maybe it's because I came from such a big family. My mom was one of 10, my dad's one of 8, my mom was a public school teacher, and so I was always around sort of community of family, and got insight early on into sort of the power of how a family lifts individuals within that family up in those connections and where that meaning comes from. And I think when I went off to college, I went to, stepping back just for a second, I was a mixed race kid adopted into an African-American family. And so I think the theme of identity and place and community was always very present for me as a young black man trying to understand and find his own place in our society, in our democracy. Mm-hmm. And that led me to go to Howard to try to sort of find myself there. And I minored in journalism and discovered documentary and heard that John Else was taking over the documentary department from the late Marlon Riggs at UC Berkeley, and knew that's where I wanted to go. And really the rest just kind of unfolded naturally. I from Boston and knew about Frederick Wiseman's work and was just really taken by this sort of intimate commitment to space and institutions and people and humanity, and taking the time to fully unpack and understand the dynamics of how humanity exists within these institutions, which are so hard to understand. And that really began my journey, being at Berkeley and seeing the community around me in the Bay Area, being this remarkably diverse place that was kind of a microcosm of America, with all its beauty and its messiness, that it was a great stage from which to explore our democracy.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a clip from Homeroom, I believe.
I think it's the featurette that sort of talks about the making of it. Yeah.
Okay, can we roll that? So this is, actually I'll just back up by saying that you made what we are now think about as your Oakland trilogy, right? So a film called The Waiting Room, which looked at hospitals in Oakland, The Force, which looked at the Oakland Police Force, and then also Homeroom, which looked at public schools. And so we're going to take a look at a clip from Homeroom here.
As the only school district in Alameda County that has its own police force, students say that money should be spent elsewhere.
This film is asking the question, what's the emotional life like for young people coming up in a rapidly changing world?
At the age of 12, I was already seeing people being arrested and confronted by school police. The message was the school district cared more about keeping us in check than protecting us.
The subjects of Homeroom resonated with me in so many different ways. I grew up in Oakland in the East Bay. Pete and I, friendship began with him helping me on Fruitville. And I think that Fruitville and Homeroom are very much in conversation with each other.
I don't really feel like they do anything to serve or protect us.
We noticed early in the process these young leaders.
My name is Zenosin Garibo, and I'm one of the 2 students that represent all 36,000 students in our district.
We didn't know where he would take us, but that if we followed him, that they would probably take us to someplace dynamic.
The time to make history, stand with us, Black and brown students, is not tomorrow, it's today.
Films had an uncanny sense of timing, the unrest that followed the murder of George Floyd. These kids were talking about some of these things before those events happened.
We spread our message by standing together. That's how they hear us.
How they found their voice in the wake of that is a powerful reminder that we need to look deeper at our young people and realize that they have agency, they have insight, they have something to teach us.
I'm so proud of y'all, for real.
You're hella inspiring.
The voices of young people can be really valuable when it comes time for change.
It's like uncovering these hidden assets and sort of rethinking how we're supporting them. And so I really hope that audiences can see that reframing and understanding in a way that changes how we see them.
Black lives, Black future, Black graduates, Black children.
You know, Pete, as you look back at this cycle of films, again, your Oakland trilogy, I'm curious what you think, in retrospect, you've been able to do with that sort of sustained, you know, decade and a half look at a city. You know, this is a question about what you think the political or cultural impact that series might have had. You produced 2 of them independently. One was made with a commercial partner, but all of them took time to really look at a place and spend time in a place. And the results of it might not be seen for another 10 years, but I'm curious, at this point, you know, I think you made The Waiting Room in 2012?
12, yeah. I mean, we began working on it. It began sort of actually in 2009. And it came out in 2012. But it was sort of, I knew in the beginning, and I also started a community or, you know, an organization called Openhood, which I wanted it to be the umbrella for the whole concept of a series, of a grand narrative. And I wanted to try to reveal and articulate the connections between pressure points like the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, the education system. When we were shooting Homeroom, The Waiting Room, one of the first people I met was a young girl who had been shot. She was 14 years old. She had been shot outside her middle school at Edna Brewer Middle School, which was around the corner from the hospital. And she wasn't in the classroom. She was in the waiting room, stuck for hours waiting to get treatment for a gunshot wound. And so I started thinking about sort of the connection, her story, and how it connected to the criminal justice system, how it connected to the education system, and that if we could sustain an engagement and tell that grand narrative, there would be a powerful insight that we could draw from that.
You know, Carrie, so you're coming from one of the largest and most influential artist services and funding entities for the indie doc sector. And I'm curious, do you see a lot of filmmakers working in this mode like Pete has been, where there's, again, been this sustained focus on a place? Is that possible given the sort of the industrial and commercial conditions now? Or are people finding other ways to be able to do that sort of socially minded, sustained, committed work? How does it look right now?
I mean, it's a huge, well, first of all, thank you for having us here. Thank you, Vince and the team. It's so great to be here. It's so wonderful to see all these faces. So it's such a range, Chi-hui, right now. And I think, you know, one of the things I think about a lot, and I did teach the history of documentary for a few years, so I'm kind of obsessed with this idea, but the history of documentary is really the history of technology. Kind of every moment that you can capture and encapsulate in documentary history really follows a technological change. And so, you know, we all got really excited for a while when we thought we were gonna have, remember the one-person band? Remember that? Like, that was, we were teaching that at the J School, like one person was gonna do everything. Well, we learned pretty quickly that was actually, you know, not optimal. This is kind of a team sport. But that said, the access to the technology has meant that, for example, in our recent cycle, we got 1,400 applications across the globe for what will be about 40 grants. So are there people working in this mode? Yes, and there are people working in a lot of modes, and telling the stories that I think we all know in this room for a lot of reasons that really only they can tell. And investing the time, the 5 to 7 years that it takes on average to make an independent film, committed to something that is often happening in their communities, something they're excited about, something they're curious about, something that they have a vision for, and they're telling those stories in so many different ways. But I think what remains true for us, and something we talk about a lot and think about a lot, is that you're not just investing in a project, you're investing in people. And so there was an investment in Pete, over years by a number of people actually in this room who believed in his vision. And he had that vision pretty early on, I think, if I remember correctly. And so that's something we talk about a lot, that you want people who are in it for the long haul. You get better at things, right? You get better at the impact. You start to understand where these stories can land and how you can use them to make narrative change. But you have to kind of make that decision about both investing in people who are just starting to do this work and in stories that are just incredible, that only they could bring, that that kind of moment of, I have never seen this before, or I was not aware of this before, which happens all the time. But then seeing remarkable talent and saying, okay, they did this thing and now they want to do this thing, and we're going to find a way to continue to invest in them because they're really, really important to our information ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And Pete, maybe we can go a little deeper into who invested in you. It's a hard business being an indie filmmaker, and the first 2 projects that you made, The Waiting Room and The Force, were made independently. They went to public television. But tell us a bit about how you sustained those 2 films. And where did the resources come from? Who backed you?
Well, before that, the first person that invested in me was my wife, my mom, my dad, myself, because I didn't have any money. Actually, the Center for New Documentary, which was a Ford and MacArthur supported initiative that John Ellis started back in 2000, which was a idea to fund filmmakers and not proposals, that led to me making my first film, which was an autobiographical film. And that opened the door for me significantly. And then, when it came time to sort of make my first, I guess you would say independent, well, that was my first independent film, but sort of stepping beyond that supportive space, I knew about like the HBOs and all those places, but I knew instinctively that if I'm making a film about a public hospital waiting room, what better place to go than public television? So I submitted naively to Open Call, to ITVS Open Call, and I got it. And I've heard so many stories about so many people have applied multiple times, and it's very competitive, and I was just lucky to get it. And so that really became the foundation, and they later funded and supported The Force, which had 13 funders, including MacArthur and Ford and Sundance. And so there's been just, I've had a lot of different types of foundations, large and small, individuals. Lisa Kleiner-Chanoff has supported some of my work. Jen Rainin has supported some of my work. And so it's been really integral in my ability to tell my stories.
Carrie, the dollars and cents of indie doc filmmaking has changed significantly in the past 5 years. Can you reflect a bit about what you've been seeing with regards to with budget, what funding resources are out there, what filmmakers have had to do to be able to finish their films and get them out there? And then also, has that been changing the films themselves? Because it's a fundamentally different landscape over the past 5 years.
Yeah, it's a fundamentally different landscape, and it's a fundamentally different landscape right this minute than it was even like 6 months ago. So, there's no question, we all know this because it changed all of our lives, that the platforms, the big streamers, fundamentally changed the way we access information and has had a huge impact on the indies. And, as many things, it's a double-edged sword. It's very exciting to think about having global reach on a platform, but we know that there's challenges that I think Sahar so beautifully pointed out. And what they have learned, I think those platforms, is that there are certain things that work really well for them, the celebrity docs, the true crime, and things that sometimes they consider documentary reality TV that some of us maybe, would take issue with. So there is no question that the landscape is entirely different. And what that has done, at its high point and at the good point, is it raised the visibility of and increased the audience appetite for nonfiction. That's super exciting. There was a moment where theatrical wasn't so great, and then it was, and now everybody's suffering. But what I think the positive part was, it created work. And we were just kind of talking about this. So it's always been a nonprofit enterprise for the most part to make independent documentary films. The math is not great. I'm also an investigative reporter, same there. It's a big investment, it's expensive, and it doesn't pay in dollars, it pays in impact, as you all have been talking about all day. I mean, that's the reward. So that's hard when something is both thought of as, for us as the makers, as value-driven, but maybe for someone else it's more commodity-driven. And one of the other kind of big things that's happened is the budgets have gotten really big. And so it changed the size of the budget, it changed the way I think storytellers think about their intellectual property. I don't know about you, but when I started making films, we owned them. I still own my work. I say this every single time. Some of you have heard me say this 500 times by now, because I always say it. My work is mine, and I can exploit it as I wish over time. And that's not so much the case anymore. Often you're giving up your rights to some of those platforms for very long periods of time. So it is a different world, and I think we are all playing catch up, and so are they. But that's why all of you in the room who do support long-form independent film are so essential. These stories, like Pete's, like The Waiting Room, I mean, if you haven't seen it, you must. It is an essential piece of viewing about the way that our healthcare system doesn't work for so many people. And what that means as a society when we let that happen. So it's really, really critical that we continue to have a philanthropic ecosystem for indies. It's just, it will not exist without it.
Pete, there is, a complex dance that folks right now have between the indie side and the commercial side, and you are right in the middle of that dance. A couple years ago, you went to the other side, and you moved away from being an independent producer.
The dark side. Say it, the dark side.
Co-founded a company called Proximity Media that's produced your past 3 films. Tell us a bit about that decision point to really kind of shift the way that you make films and the way that you resource films. And what was that informed by?
It was just a unique set of circumstances. I met Ryan. I was making The Waiting Room. The Waiting Room had just come out. I think somebody at San Francisco Film Society, it was Michelle Turner-Soleo, was like, Ryan, you need to meet Pete. Because I think Ryan was trying to get access to Highland Hospital, which is where Oscar Grant, the subject of Fruitvale Station, was born and later died. And they said, oh, maybe Pete can help you. And we just became quick friends. I mean, he and I were kind of working in parallel. He was doing in a fiction, and he had made a couple of beautiful films before Fruitvale, which if you can ever see them, Locks and Fig, which are just stunning. And these are all set in Oakland, and so he was doing on the fiction side what I was doing on the documentary side. So we just became close friends. And obviously his rocket took off, Black Panther and all that stuff, very, very commercial. And what we saw with Ryan was this ability to shift the perspective and the angle and to do it in a wildly commercial, successful way. And that a lot of people took notice of that. But I just kind of forgot about, he went off on his way. I was still doing my thing. And the industry took note. Bob Iger approached him and said, I want to bring you into the Disney ecosystem so that we can allow your perspective to inform sort of how we're, as a company, storytelling. Parallel to that, there was a new vertical kind of studio ecosystem within Disney that was born called the Onyx Collective, which was the intention there was to allow a studio to foster and promote and develop particular voices of color. And so our companies we're kind of both born around the same time. Ryan approached me and asked me to sort of co-found the company with him and run the nonfiction division. And I agreed. I probably wouldn't have done this if it had been Amazon calling me or HBO calling. No, all respect to HBO. I think they're doing the good stuff. But you know, Netflix or Hulu proper had approached me, I wouldn't have done it. But Ryan's a very special creative. He's making an impact, and my goal there was to try to leverage and use that platform in whatever way I could.
Homeroom in an earlier era probably would have been a PBS film, right? But it was not. It was produced by Proximity and went to Hulu. And I'm curious where you are now. Your new film is about Steph Curry. It's coming out very soon. So you're working in very commercial spaces. Just curious about what you think that grounding in public media, how that fits into where you are now. Are there possibilities for? Because we've seen some models where people have been able to do licensing agreements between public media and one of these streamers. That seems to be a moment of the past. But how are you holding both of those pieces within your new role?
Well, it's definitely informing my work, and we have a film coming out that's going to premiere at Tribeca. It's called Anthem, and the premise is if you were to reimagine a new national anthem for America that better reflected our story, what would it be and how would you do it? It's a sort of a social experiment documentary that follows composer Chris Bowers and DJ Dahi, who's Drake and Kendrick Lamar's producer, across America on this road trip to discover the sound of a nation. So that idea is a very sort of public kind of television idea, and what we're trying to do is really press on our partners and present these stories that reflect those values. How and they bump up against sort of commercial realities, we'll discover over the coming months and years as we bring these stories to the marketplace. But our goal is to challenge the marketplace, challenge the buyers at the streaming partners. We're seeing positive signs. Marjan just bought Miha out of Sundance, and she runs documentaries for Disney Plus, and has this interest. And as I think the commercial marketplace woke up to the power of Black Panther, that we have hidden perspectives that are powerful, that audiences desire, that audiences want, just as we've discovered in recent years that there's an audience for nonfiction that was always there. We just need to speak to them and support them and build ecosystems to allow these stories to be made. Whether they land on Hulu or PBS or Amazon or HBO, we're not sure, but we need to create an ecosystem for all those stories to be told.
Right now, it seems like all of the distribution systems are in a moment of flux. Carrie, we've been talking, and people are using the word collapse right now in terms of the commercial documentary sector. The public media system has been a stalwart for indies, but also a lot of folks are saying it needs to adapt to the times as well. And I think a big challenge here is, stuff can get made, but then can it get distributed? Can it be discovered? How can people actually find it? Can you tell us a bit more about this moment? Because it is a really complex moment, and there's a window of opportunity also to make some shifts too.
Right. So, one of the things that I feel strongly, and it has evolved and it's changed, but initially, at its root, the platforms were technology companies. They weren't content companies, and they're driven by the culture of Silicon Valley, which is a very different culture than, say, Hollywood, right? Now Hollywood has had to adapt, and PBS has had to adapt. Everyone's had to adapt. But at its root, these are tech companies that use data and algorithms and all the things that we now know about to drive content and content decisions. That's not exactly the world that we all grew up in. So the moment is really tough. It is a boom and bust economy, often in tech, as we know, and they're still figuring things out. What the advantage they have is the massive investment, right, that public media doesn't have. But public media is the stable entity in the house right now. It's the stable one, it's the accessible one. And we know when we put our films, as Pete did, Pete knows what his films did in terms of viewership on public media. I would imagine you don't have that same data from Hulu for Homeroom, right? So it is this kind of stable pillar. It always has been, it continues to be. I hope that everybody here will hear that and invest wherever and however you can in those stations. It was really interesting to hear that earlier talk as well. I want to also say there's this sense that it could be like, oh, we're a little bit behind technologically, but everybody was behind technologically. The New York Times was behind technologically. Like, you know, nobody really understood what was happening until, you know, the kind of on-ramp became very steep. So, I'm always, maybe I'm just, I think documentary filmmakers are just optimists, because otherwise why would we ever continue to do this? So I kind of look at, yes, it's a collapse, and it's really painful for some storytellers right now, and I don't make any bones about that. You know, sales, I hope this is okay for me to say, sales have been slow this year. Many of us know that, but I always feel like wherever there's crisis and collapse, like, there is opportunity, and there's opportunity for the stable organizations. That's where the opportunity sits, because the rest of them are just like figuring it out and panicking a bit. And also, to be totally frank, have let go of staff that is incredibly valuable, that maybe did share some of our values and had a lot of experience and had a lot of curatorial experience. I mean, curation is not an accident. It's not an accident what we all see, and how you pick the good stuff, you know, the things that are really going to grab people and make a difference. So it's a tough time, but it will settle, and they will come back for a number of reasons. They will come back, and so this is a moment to kind of strike and do some interesting things, I think.
Mm-hmm. You know, this moment we're seeing, you know, one dynamic certainly is the corporate consolidation and the collapse of the commercial market for documentary, and we're seeing a lot of risk averseness within that realm too, for independent projects and for projects that are really looking deeply at structural inequality and the big issues of the day. And of course, we're catapulting into a really complicated election season too, where a lot of stuff is going to be happening. I know both of you are very concerned about capital D democracy. Long-form documentaries play a very important role in this. I'm wondering if you could both share your thoughts on that. We've talked a lot today about journalism, about podcasts. And you know, Josh, Jacob both is talking about how there's a certain role for the feature-length documentary and really advocating for short-form work to really have a certain type of impact, you know. But I'm curious about how you think about the work that you either make or support within that larger ecosystem, because its theory of change is a little bit different. It's not like a film is going to go and make a policy change. It's like, it's something that's a little bit more slow burning and perhaps cumulative over time. But tell us a bit about how you think about your work situated within a larger political discourse.
Do you want to go?
Well, this is a little bit off topic, but some of the biggest impact right now is actually in the commercial marketplace is commercials, like commercials that you see on TV, where you can sort of place, you know, a mixed race couple or a same-sex couple, and then you don't have to comment on it. It just is, and it's like helping to normalize and project out this just sort of message that these are our values. This is what America looks like. These are what families look like in America. And, you know, there are so many conversations and sort of, you know, divisions in our country of how we see each other that I think now more than ever, and I've been at this for what since 90, I don't know, since 99 now, 4 years or something. More than ever, I think the impact of these stories is that the urgency of the need for us to tell these stories so that we can see each other. And I'm an optimist too. I still am an optimist, despite the divisions in our country. I believe that storytelling can have a huge impact, and when there is this heightened level of urgency, those stories matter more. The investments matter more, large and small, and so.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the impact part is, impact in our field is hard to capture. You know, think about some of the films that you see now that are 10, 20, 30, 40 or more years old, right, and still really have a lot of heft and weight to them, and are still really relevant. So sometimes you can capture things pretty quickly, and then sometimes they take a longer lead. But what I'll say about the capital D democracy to me is, you know, we're a piece of the puzzle always. You know, there's a lot of nonprofit journalists in the room. To me, what is critical about it is almost, I mean, it does matter, but I'm just going to say, like, in my heart, it almost doesn't matter so long as we have a thriving independent ecosystem. So, you know, an ecosystem that is not under authoritarian control, if you will, right? Or where the message isn't controlled. I mean, to me, that's the play here, is that we have to have a thriving independent ecosystem to have a healthy democracy, almost regardless. And I'm not, obviously there's a lot of bad messaging out there, and we know this, and so I don't, you know, it gets dicey because I'm not advocating for that, but freedom of speech is a real thing, and freedom of expression is a real thing. And if we start to lose the spaces where those are supported and exist, we are in real trouble.
Absolutely. We're almost out of time, but I do want to say, there's many different ways in which folks in this room can be supporting this ecosystem. Obviously, we need to have investments in many different areas, in journalism, in arts and culture, and many others, and especially as well as in feature documentary. We can be supporting individuals as practice, as, not around projects, but around practices, supporting Pete for 10 years to make films, et cetera. A lot of funders are funding content directly. A lot of funders work through re-granting relationships, as Sundance does. You work with a lot of corporate and philanthropic partners to re-grant their dollars. So there's a lot of different entry points into this funding ecosystem to make sure that this sector is vibrant. Tomorrow there will be a breakout session for documentary funders. So I hope many folks are able to join because we can go a lot deeper into these conversations. We're almost out of time. Given that, I'm not sure if Pete or Carrie, if you have any last words around how this room can really, engage their work and really continue to support this ecosystem.
Well, I'll say, going back to sort of how my career got started with my autobiography, which was about the impact that my drug addiction had on my family and my friends in a subject matter that's very difficult to talk about in Black families, which is alcoholism and addiction, the proposal wasn't supported like I was supported as an individual artist. And I think that, looking out now and sort of seeing, like, in the spirit of homeroom, that we went into this high school where all these kids, their SAT scores are in the gutter, their GPAs are terrible, but there's the vibrancy and the creativity and the potential that they all had was there. It just wasn't seen, it wasn't being captured. And I think that's the power of what you can do is seeing the individuals and the creators and identifying the voices of that are out there now at this moment is a really astounding opportunity leading down into the future, 10, 20, 30 years down the line.
Yeah, I'll say it on the side, we're seeing, from the funding side, we're seeing so many moves toward fellowships, unrestricted individual practice-based grants, et cetera, moving beyond project granting, especially within the arts, which is really fun.
Unrestricted, right.
Yeah.
And I got a United States Artist Fellowship, which was an incredible gift to me at a particular moment in my career, and they were supporting me. They weren't supporting, a particular idea. So.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think, I think I got this data from MacArthur that long-form nonfiction is one of the least supported philanthropically. It looks like there's a lot of resources, but actually, journalism and other forms take up a lot of the philanthropic dollars, and we need more support. It's really essential. It's critical work, and it's very powerful, I think, as was referenced many times today. So this is the moment, we really can't lose that ecosystem, even though the kind of industry side is kind of collapsing and having difficulty at the time. So if you need help evangelizing in your organizations, I'm happy to have a talk with you. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Pete. Thanks, everyone.